Hello YouTube vintage radio collectors and restorers. Okay, it's kind of hard to tell what this is because it's just a chassis. But this is a Zenith 6G05 chassis from the model G615. And I have it out in the garage. It's a brown Bakelite case, big square gold dial, huge pointer, kind of an iconic late 40s design. I picked this up from an antique shop a few days ago while we're out on a road trip, and it's all here. I mean, there's this part of the chassis, and you gotta ask yourself, okay, what do I just fix the unit or do I restore it? What do you do to make these work good again? And the reason I thought I'd bring this up, I sold somebody a Philco radio and we were having a conversation out in the garage, and he's saying, well, I have a guy, he's fixed several of my radios. I have about 260 radios. And he said they worked for a while, then they quit. I said, well, what do you mean by fixing a radio? And he said, well, whatever, if there's a bad tube or a bad resistor, he replaces it. And I said, well, with these two radios at this point, that doesn't work anymore. And when I got in this hobby 40 some years ago, I'd pick up radios just like this. I'll give you an example here. This wax cap, that's original. These ceramic caps, it's actually not a ceramic cap, it's actually a ceramic case coated in wax but a paper cap inside. That's been replaced in the 60s. This here had a couple of replacement tubes, so 3 out of the 6 tubes are Zenith, the rest were other brands. And what you got to ask yourself in 2021 with one of these radios is, what can you reuse? Because so much of it has to be reworked, and it takes a long time. I explained it to this guy. I said, you need to restore these sets if you want to use them fairly often, have them reliable. You need to restore them. And I'll give you an example. Okay, you can take a filter capacitor, you can restuff the can, but the resistors, the capacitors around it, they're either going to be way off value, dried up. And I'll give you an example. I've replaced several resistors in this. I test each resistor in the unit. Any resistors over a quarter watt should be replaced because they handle more power. So there's a 1000 ohm 1 watt resistor. I've upgraded to 2 watt. There's a 33 ohm here, 150 cathode resistor on the output tube. Replace all of those. Put a nice terminal board in. Use separate caps, separate components. But here's some things that become problematic after 60, 70, 80 years. The obvious one's the filter cap. And it used to be you could get away with just fixing the radio. Here's a problem. These PEC modules, packaged electronic circuit, I don't know how well you can see that. That one contains several caps and resistors. It's basically the network between the preamp tube and the output tube. And for the most part they work, but I noticed this one, it actually had the one lead had been repaired, been soldered just a bit, and then some kind of sealant put on it, so it had actually broken before. And I've had issues with these. You put the radio together, you play it for a few hours, you get mysterious drops in volume. It can be a number of things, but it's those, and it's actually easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace it with individual capacitors and resistors, and it's not that hard. It's 5 or 6 components. And of course, silver mica disease. This has these Zenith, they look like the older style cans that had fixed inductance and variable capacitor, but no, these are actually fixed capacitance, variable inductance, mica caps inside. So as I go along, I'm going to desolder them both, take them apart, and get rid of those mica caps inside. If there's room, I put new ones inside or underneath here. So basically you're looking at all capacitors except ceramic and mica. Those usually survive. Of course, soldering, there's some rubber wire in here, and it's actually quite good. If you touch it and it starts crumbling apart, well, get out the spools and start replacing, because it will flake apart. Any resistors, like I say, I test every resistor. And if they're even just a little bit off, and they're usually way off. These old quarter-watt carbon units, almost everyone is drifted. But most likely ones to drift are the ones that operate with a bit more current. So, another thing is tightening up the tube sockets. There's sometimes they become loose and you've got to re-crimp them, each connection, clean the pins of the tubes, clean the controls. Yes. Here's another thing. This dial string is nicely frayed. Okay, and here's Murphy's Law. Dial string works, tuning indicator moves, no problem. Put it back together. Somebody buys it or whatever from you. It's like, hey, I went to tune the stations and the dial string broke. It never fails. I almost restring every single one. You just have to. They get dried out. Once you start jerking them around, there's a couple caps and resistors I'll be putting in. So it can take a lot of work. So I asked the guy, we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, what do you pay for the average repair? And he goes, well, if it's a used part, maybe 20 bucks. If it's a new part, maybe 30. I said, you're putting in used parts? What do you mean used parts? Well, he's got some old capacitors he's pulled out of other old radios, some old resistors. Well, here's the thing. It may harm originality, but these orange dip caps will never have to be changed again. They'll last 1,000 years. I'm not kidding. I know they're not like the original, but to put vintage wax paper caps back in, I said, you're lucky if they last more than a few months. So there's another thing. But, sometimes I get into, it's not so much, these components are no longer expensive. Like modern Mylar caps, those are 9 cents a piece. And I buy stuff in bulk from some of the big online outfits. They're not that expensive. Like these Miat caps, I think they're $3.80 a piece. And then if you buy 10, it drops to $2.97 or something like that. So they're not that expensive compared to what we used to pay. Anyway, just thought that would be interesting. Thanks for watching and listening.